Hello. Good evening to one and all. My name is Toh Kian Lam. I'm the Executive Director of the Local Community Engagement Office. Before we begin, can I request that you switch your mobile devices to silent mode? Okay, and of course, I'm glad to say that to see so many of you here, despite the heavy rain. I was told in Orchard Road, it's like raining cats and dogs. I was told in Chinatown, the raindrops is as big as 4 kg Mao Shan durian. That's what people told me. Okay, for those who are visiting NTU for the first time, welcome, and welcome to one of the top 15 most beautiful campuses in the world, said Leisure and Travel Magazine and American Express. So top 15. In Asia, there are only two. One in Singapore, one in Beijing, which is Beida, all right? Now, many universities in the world have got three major objectives: education, research, and social responsibility. As you know, NTU has done very, very well in the past decade in terms of education and research. In fact, we are ranked number 11th in the latest QS World University rankings and number 1 in Asia, which also means number 1 in Singapore. Nobody clap, eh? So, of course, our staff and students have also done quite a fair bit in terms of social responsibility, but we'd like to do more. We want to help build capacity of and also create positive impact on our community. So one of the things that we have done, we roll out is this, the Did You Know Monthly Talk Series. We do it once a month, and this is our 5th run. And one of the purposes is to actually help Singaporeans appreciate research and its benefits. So today we are very honored to have Professor Alan Chan, the Dean of our College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, to be our guest speaker. And he'll speak on explorations in Confucian philosophy. Prof. Chan received his PhD degree from University of Toronto, Canada in Chinese and comparative philosophy and religion. Prior to joining NTU in the year late 2009, he was the professor of philosophy and associate provost for undergraduate education at NUS. While at NUS, he also twice received the Teaching Excellence Award. Prof. Chan also sits on quite a number of boards. For example, he is the chair of the board of directors, Confucian Institute, NTU Singapore. He's also the joint, or rather co-chairman of the governing council of the Center for Contemporary Art, NTU Singapore. And he also sits on several other boards, such as the Oxford Bibliography of Chinese Studies, as well as International Confucian Society. Now, without further ado, let us put our hands together to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Alan Chan. Now, before that, a good news. From 1st January 28 onwards, Professor Chan will be promoted to NTU Vice President for Alumni and Advancement.
Thank you very much, Kian Nam. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Now, as it usually happens in a technological university, your microphone doesn't work all the time. I was actually going to say that Kian Nam is absolutely right. We really need to do more community engagement. After all, a university is always situated in a particular social context. If we do not engage our community, then we risk becoming what has been called an ivory tower. Now, since some of you may be visiting the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences for the first time, and since I have a captive audience, I thought I would first of all introduce you to the college. How many of you have actually heard of HASS at NTU. You might think that NTU with a big T in the middle is basically an engineering university. And it is true that we are very, very strong in science and engineering. And we also recently have started a medical school jointly with Imperial College London. But humanities, arts, and social sciences, at least for the past 10 years, have become a major component of the NTU educational landscape. And it stands to reason, because as the world becomes increasingly complex, as the challenges we face become increasingly difficult, those challenges really cannot be resolved by any one discipline alone. And NTU firmly believes that knowledge does not grow well in insularity, and really to address some of the so-called grand challenges we face today, we need the concerted effort of all branches of knowledge coming together to address them. And in that context, you find not only a college of humanities, arts, and social sciences teaching about 5,000 degree students, but in fact, a vibrant research culture in the college, working with the other schools and colleges on campus, addressing some of the most important issues we face today. The college now comprises a School of Art, Design, and Media. I hope you have a chance to visit that school. Did you see it on your way in? The very beautiful building with a grass sloping roof. If you go inside, there's actually a very wonderful water feature as well. And it is particularly strong in areas such as digital animation, filmmaking, product design, as well as filmmaking. Humanities, you know, I think, social sciences, the mainstay of any great university, and we basically offer a full range of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. And I am a member of the Department of Philosophy. The Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information is the oldest school in the college. There was a rumor that it was shifted from NUS when NTU was formally established in 1991 in order to, how should I put it, to have better gender balance, because the engineering school was basically all boys at that time. But as I said, it's a rumor. The Nanyang Center for Public Administration is a very interesting school because it targets especially government officials from China as well as from ASEAN, and we offer them customized training programs in good governance. And finally, this is our research center located in the college, but the college is also centrally involved in a number of other units in the university, one of which, and this one I'm really very proud of, is the Center for Contemporary Art located outside this Jurong campus in Gilman Barracks. How many of you have ever visited Gilman Barracks? You like it? Old British Army barracks, now totally refurbished into Singapore's latest art precinct. So they have quite a number of very good galleries there. But in order to inject the kind of intellectual dynamism that such a precinct would need, the Economic Development Board of Singapore has actually come to NTU and asked us whether we would like to collaborate with them. And we thought it's a wonderful idea. And 4 years ago, the CCA Singapore was formally established, and it mounts really very interesting exhibitions. And I certainly would encourage all of you, on a weekend or during the day it might be a bit hot, but in the evenings that whole area is actually very comfortable, very, very pretty as well. This is also a new development in the college, and it is a joint research institute with King's College London. They are particularly interested in working with us on addressing issues faced by society in the age of rapid globalization and disruption. The Confucius Institute, how many of you have attended lectures organized by the Confucius Institute? It actually does very interesting things, introducing various aspects of Chinese culture. And it is located in One North, in the area known as Biopolis. And finally, this wonderful building, the Chinese Heritage Center, which serves as both a museum as well as a research center, reaching out especially to the community, not only talking about Chinese culture, traditionally understood, but also looking into what it means to be a Chinese person outside China, in Southeast Asia especially. It has a permanent exhibition that is very aptly called More or Less Chinese. So, probably enough of an introduction, and now we go to the main event, or should I say the main course. This is deliberate because I will come back to the food metaphor later on in my discussion. But the idea really arose when I was asked to develop an online course on Confucian philosophy, and I thought that would be a challenge. Nowadays, we always talk about using technologies in teaching and learning, and frankly, often I felt like a fraud because I actually didn't know what that technology involved. So I said to myself, I must try it. I must try it. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful experience. So the course will be ready early next year. All 53 videos have been completed. Some actually filmed on location in the city of Qufu, the birthplace of Confucius. I hope some of you at least would take a look when it is launched. But just to give you a taste of what this course is about, this is the no, I think we need to show the video first.
Welcome to this course on Confucian philosophy. Over the next 6 weeks, I would like to explore with you the teachings of Confucius, especially as they are preserved in the Analects of Confucius. I will need to provide some historical background in order to situate Confucian philosophy in its own context, but I will keep this part of the course short. This is not because the background is uninteresting or unimportant, but our primary concern is to engage some of the key concepts in Confucian philosophy critically. This will enable us to not only understand Chinese culture better, but also assess the possible contribution of Confucian philosophy to global issues today. The first part of the course will give a brief introduction to Confucius and the world in which he lived and taught. The text of the Analects will be introduced next. Then we'll jump right into the more philosophically meaty part of the course, which is to discuss some of the key concepts that I think are of particular importance to understanding Confucian philosophy. These concepts have been given sustained attention throughout Chinese history, and we will look at how they were interpreted by some of the major champions of Confucian teachings in traditional China, beginning with Mencius and Xunzi. Their views on human nature are especially important and have given much impetus to the subsequent development of Confucian philosophy. Some mention of Neo-Confucianism, however brief, will also be important in my view. Neo-Confucianism came onto the Chinese scene during the Song dynasty, and much of what we refer to as Confucianism today really reflects the interpretation of the Neo-Confucians. Here I will focus especially on the 12th century thinker Zhu Xi. Methodologically, we will need to be historically imaginative, asking ourselves what we would have done if we were in Confucius' position or as Confucius' disciples. We will also need to exercise analytical rigor. This course is not about how great Confucian philosophy is or how terrible it may be, but an exploration in meaning and value of ideas and ideals that are important to Chinese culture and may have universal significance. In our approach, one of the key points I will be emphasizing is that Confucian philosophy is not a rigid set of doctrines, but rather it harbors a diversity of views which accounts for its vitality throughout Chinese history. The label Confucianism is convenient, but it remains an abstraction. We will need to be careful not to reduce a rich and complex tradition to something uniform or monolithic. There's always a tension between the desire to forge an orthodoxy, the right interpretation, which entails intellectual closure, and the need for innovation and renewal. The story of Confucian philosophy is also set in that context. Confucianism is a living tradition, and in the last section of the course, I would like to explore the place of Confucianism in Chinese culture today. The 20th century Christian theologian Karl Rahner proposed a theory of anonymous Christians. Now, of course, the context is very different, but I have always wondered whether the Chinese are, as it were, anonymous Confucians. The influence of Confucianism is pervasive. It seems to have left an indelible mark on all aspects of Chinese thought and culture. This is an issue that obviously we will need to look at very carefully. Now, however, let's get back to our studio. It's time to get down to work.
What do you think? Is that a course that you would like to take? There's still time for me to delete this entire segment and redo it. Now, what would you put inside this course? And of course, there will be a course website where I'll be able to explain what does it mean to be an anonymous Christian according to Rahner's theory. Basically, it means that you are so much under the influence of a particular tradition, whether you acknowledge it or not. Your sense of values, how you conduct yourself, your values that you hold dear would still be under the influence of that particular tradition. Can we say the same for Confucianism as it applied to the Chinese today? That has always been a question that I want to explore. But coming back to my question, what would you put into the course? I have to assume that the audience, who can be from anywhere around the world, would have very little, if any at all, background in Chinese history and culture. which may not be the case for this audience, because I think I can assume that most of you will have some sense of what Confucianism is about. But for a larger, wider audience, I think I would need to provide some basic historical background, talking about ancient China even before the time of Confucius, not only as an historical introduction, but also to make clear that no thinker existed in an historical vacuum. So even Confucius, we have to imagine the world in which he lived, what kind of ideas were prevalent in his days and might have influenced his thinking. So in this section, each video is about 8 to 10 minutes long. I was told to keep it no more than 10 minutes or else the audience will fall asleep. And having watched the videos myself, I have to say I must agree. We won't be able to talk about these topics, but in this particular lecture, I talked about the kind of education that was prevalent in ancient China. I mean, when you try to imagine what Confucius did, wouldn't you want to know what books he read, what kind of education he received? And that is the purpose, of this particular lecture. This particular work, The Classic of Changes or the I Ching, is of particular interest to me, and it remains one of the most influential works in Chinese culture. Then, a little bit about the life of Confucius, and very importantly, how do we learn about his teachings and philosophy? Are there particular books that we have to refer to in order to get a sense of what he believed? And this is why we need to understand the nature of the work that has come to be called the Analects of Confucius. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Then I think we can go into exploring what he taught, the vision of Confucius, and this is actually what we will be focusing on this evening. 17 lectures, time 8 minutes each. That would be how long, huh? No, I'll just summarize some of the key points here so that you can actually get to go home to rest. After that, for this particular course, then I went on to discuss a little bit about the development of the Confucian tradition. After the death of Confucius, what did his disciples do? Were there different views of what he actually taught? Sometimes, I still remember when I was a student, I missed classes. I misunderstood what my professor was trying to say. And I'm actually quite sure some of his disciples would have done exactly the same. Two students might have come up with differing reports of what the master said. And that you can actually discern if you read the Analects of Confucius carefully, which is a very important point for a critical understanding of Confucius' teaching, of Confucian philosophy, as distinguished from what has been reported in popular culture. If you are serious about understanding Confucian philosophy, you must engage the Analects of Confucius critically. And if you do, you will then have to decide for yourself, what is Confucius trying to say? Now, I won't go through all these topics, but if you are interested, some of Confucius' later followers were particularly interested in the question of human nature. And we will have to try to understand why that particular topic was so important to them. Why would you want to learn about human nature? That will have impact on your views of education, that would have tremendous influence on your views on laws, how to govern, how to organize a society, if you believe that human beings are essentially morally good. The kind of education you would advocate, the kind of social organization you would like to see would be very different from the system designed with the assumption that human beings need to be corrected. So that debate has proven to be very, very important in the development of Confucian philosophy. Then finally, in the last part of the course, I really wanted to explore the contemporary significance of the Confucian tradition, but I didn't know how to do it. How would you do it? In the end, I decided to speak with a good number of people. Some of them are scholars, both Chinese and non-Chinese. I also spoke with 2 descendants of Confucius. It's not that special. The clan of Confucius actually claims over 2 million descendants today, but I managed to find 2 of them who were willing to discuss what does it mean, especially to them, to be a follower, a descendant of Confucius. And then I also spoke with some of our alumni. How many of you are NTU alum here? Great. Huh? And as well as some of our current students as well. And in the end, I came to the conclusion that even though they disagree, even though they may disagree what Confucianism means to them, there is no question that you cannot ignore Confucianism even today. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but you cannot ignore it. Later, I hope we'll have some time to actually share, reflect on your own sense of what Confucian, what the Confucian tradition means to you. How many of you, for example, would consider Confucianism to be a religion? But there are temples of Confucius, are there not? If you go down Orchard Road, or just Pioneer Road, doesn't matter, and ask anyone, excuse me, are you a Confucian? How would you think they might answer? If you ask the same question, ask a slightly different question and say, excuse me, are you a Buddhist? Are you a Christian? They would say either yes or no, without having to give very much thought to the question. But if you ask them, are you a Confucian, to a Chinese person, that is actually a very perplexing question. So how do we define ourselves? And that is part and parcel of why we want to explore Confucian philosophy even today. So, let's start from the man himself. To save some time, could someone please tell me what his real name is? Confucius, that name doesn't sound exactly Chinese, does it? Yes, please. How many of you actually knows his Chinese name? Just a show of hands. Huh? We just call him Kongzi. Surname Kong, Master Kong. It's actually quite remarkable to think if you were an early Christian missionary going into China, and you are confronted with this name, 孔子 or 孔夫子. How would you translate that into your language, which was at that time Latin? So from 孔夫子, eventually you get Confucius. But try, when you say Confucian philosophy, try not to make fun comparing it with Confucian. I get that all the time from my students. Now, for such an important person, someone who has come to be revered as the greatest teacher and sage of China, we actually knew very little about him. If you go to China today, every single city is trying to outdo one another to build the tallest statue of Confucius. Well, okay, there may be a profit motive in there somewhere, making your own city a major tourist attraction, but nevertheless, there is something about this person, about what he did, what he taught, that has proven to be of lasting influence and value. Could someone explain these paintings for me? It's just for fun. Have you ever heard of these phrases? This one literally says 2 dragons and 5 old persons. What do you think they are? No idea? There are lots and lots of legends surrounding the birth, or even before Confucius was conceived, how various omens came to present themselves, and this particular one actually announced 2 dragons and 5 wise old persons coming to celebrate the birth of Confucius. Have you heard of those stories before? But that is also part and parcel of the received tradition, even though we may not pay any attention to them today. If you go to the city of Qufu, which is located in the province of Shandong, you will see that video was filmed at the Temple of Confucius. And not far from it, there is actually a cave identified as the Cave of Confucius, and legend has it that that was where he was born. And this really raises all sorts of questions comparing Confucius with other major religious figures in world religions. But I'm just mentioning it for your interest. The way I approach Confucius really was to see him essentially as an engaged public intellectual. How much do you know of the world in which Confucius lived? It was a fairly advanced civilization by world standards in the 6th century BC. Yet it was also a time marked by real political and social turbulence. From a very stable government, gradually declining, deteriorating, suffering on the rise, warfare became increasingly rampant and with greater ferocity. Iron weapons were beginning to be widely used, with cavalry, chariots. Warfare was serious, and the whole country was broken into many, many feudal states, from 50-odd down to 30-something, down to 7, finally down to 1, but that was after the time of Confucius. The time of Confucius was still marked by really incessant struggles for power and control among the various states. Then I put this to you. If you were an educated person, if you were concerned about the humanity of your world, what would you have done? What would you have done? I might migrate to Australia, but Confucius did not. He tried to serve one of the states, his home state, which is again in present-day Shandong province. But his proposals, his way of governance was not accepted. Then what do? Try Malaysia. So he traveled, in fact, from state to state, precisely to try to convince at least one enlightened ruler to try to put his program of reform into practice, but without success. And later we will need to ask the question, why was he not successful? Was there something wrong with his program? Which particular form of governance would you, as a ruler, imagine yourself as someone in a position of authority in those days, what kind of government would you want to see in your state? I would like to put Confucius in that particular context. Someone who is keen, someone who is absolutely concerned with the well-being of society, and yet not finding someone who would put his ideas into practice. Now again, then what do? Play golf? Then he decided to devote himself to teaching. I think you all know this part of the story, and how then he came to be remembered as the model teacher of China. What else do you know of Confucius? Good time to share. What have you heard about this man? Why do you think he is so important? It's actually very interesting for urban planners. What does he look like? What does he look like? And every city is trying really very hard to come up with its own image of Confucius. Yes, please. Very ugly. This gentleman is saying that Confucius is very ugly. In some depictions, yes. In some depictions, yes. And why do you think that is the case? In some depictions, the intent is to portray Confucius as an extraordinary individual. If he looks like me, he is not that special. Let's face it. So how do we remember someone whom you regard as larger than life? Someone whom you regard as more than an ordinary mortal. So the point here is that remembering Confucius is also a very important part of the unfolding or the development of the Confucian tradition. Now, how should we then analyze the philosophy of Confucius? Don't look at the slide yet. Just tell me off the top of your head, what does Confucian philosophy mean to you? Is there one concept that stands out, that to you captures the essence of Confucianism? Filial piety is one answer. The goodness of the individual. Sorry? Educator, yes. Yes. Excellent. We will actually come to visit that particular passage later on. You all have particular remembrances of what you consider to be the key to Confucian philosophy. So what do we do with all those concepts? Goodness, filial piety, empathy. What do we do? Just do a catalog? Education, learning. So what do we do with all these concepts? And how do they relate to one another? What I would suggest is that we try to look for what I would consider an umbrella concept that would encompass all these specific notions. Start with that and see whether we can put some order to what we can discern from the book that has come to be called the Analects of Confucius, or in Chinese, the 论语. How many of you have read the entire 论语? It's not that long, you know. My grandfather's generation would have read and be able to memorize the entire text. I first read it when I was also in high school, but only excerpts and individual sayings. But it is really the kind of book that would repay at least one reading every year. Every time I read it, I find something different. I find something new. It's the kind of book that will grow with you, when we will learn in a moment why it is the case. But as a text, essentially, the Analects of Confucius is a collection of sayings attributed to Confucius, as reported by his disciples, often in the context of answering specific questions put to him by his disciples. In the Analects, you will also find conversations between Confucius and some of the feudal lords in power at that time. And there are also miscellaneous sayings that are probably intended for educational purposes. But the important point to note is that the 论语, the Analects of Confucius, was not completed until long after the passing of the great sage. So that raises an interpretational problem for us, because it is hard. There are no recorders. There is no way to really verify the veracity of the reported saying. But nevertheless, by the Han Dynasty or so, which is, Han Dynasty is about what time now? Han Dynasty would be what? Roughly 206 BC to 220 AD. So still very, very early on. The Analects, as we have it today, was more or less formed. Recently in China, they just discovered portions of a very old version of the Analects. It's amazing archaeological discoveries in China these days, what they discover. And that particular find at least confirms that the text as we have it today was pretty much the same as what it was in the days of Han Dynasty China. And in the Analects, we find this curious statement, which I will ask those in the audience who would read Chinese to translate for me. Still good. Did you hear that translation? Is that how you would read it as well? Literally, in the morning, here, what is this word? What does it mean? What way? P-I-E? A-Y-E? And then in the evening, one can die a contented person. That should mean something, shouldn't it? If you were to identify one key word in this sentence, what word would it be? See? And this is what I would propose as the umbrella concept in order to make sense of the many sayings recorded in the 论语. The word Dao, literally, in classical Chinese, which is very different from modern Chinese, usually the character would have a verbal sense as well as a nominal sense. As a verb, Dao would indicate someone heading towards a certain direction. Look at the word, even the modern version of the word. If you do away with the radical component on the left-hand side, what does the remaining character mean? Huh? This one. This one means the head. It means the head, doesn't it? Shou. Heading in a certain direction. And by extension, the word Dao, in its verbal sense, actually could mean something like speaking. Just like what I am doing right now. 胡说八道. Translate, talking nonsense. But as a noun, as a noun, it points to exactly as you have translated it, a pathway, a road, a carriageway, and that is a very apt metaphor to suggest a particular vision of how things ought to be, a particular way of understanding the world and how to make it a better place. Confucius did not invent this particular concept. Rather, it is common to all schools of thought in ancient China. And some of them are actually so concerned with this concept that they have come to be remembered as the Taoists, the thinkers who advocate the Tao. But at that time, every philosopher, every intellectual would have his Tao, his program, his vision in order to resolve all the difficulties the world faced at that time. So I thought this could be a useful general concept in order to present the particular teachings of Confucius, to indicate how important this means to Confucius. This particular saying should suffice. If the way had prevailed in the world, then I wouldn't have to change anything. As if to say, there is a certain inherent order in the universe which has gone awry, which has been lost or eclipsed, resulting precisely in the kind of suffering that Confucius saw in his day, and which explains his determination to recover, to reform the current in order to realign the world with what he considers to be the Tao. Then, the next question obviously is, what is this Tao according to Confucius? And then we find this also interesting saying, and some translation on your part is again required. So I put anyone, I really want to see how our younger audience actually might be able to read. What does it mean? In book 1, the second passage, you read that according, actually this is attributed to one of Confucius' disciples, that there is this title called Junzi. And I'll come back to it in a moment. If he cultivates the fundamentals, or the roots, to be more precise, when the roots are established, then the way will grow. That raises two questions for me. Who is this Junzi person? What does he have to do to cultivate the so-called fundamentals or roots? Look at the first term first. How would you translate the term Junzi? Yes? Oh. Yes. Yes. Very good. That is a very important part of the teachings of Confucius, but it does not quite answer the question, because what is a father or ruler ought to do? That saying only says, if you're a father, be a father. But we still have to figure out what is the ideal fatherhood. And here we get a hint that there are certain fundamental concepts, work to be done in order to realize, to enable us to fulfill that condition. But look at the term again. How would you translate it? Junzi. Huh? Gentleman? Agreed? That, in fact, you're absolutely right. That's the standard translation. But I want you to focus on the words themselves. Sometimes you have to suspend your knowledge of modern Chinese in order to understand how certain concepts have evolved over time. What did Confucius do to those words? That is what I want to find out. So I want you to translate Junzi for me, character by character. What does the first word mean? Jun meaning what? King, lord, anyone who has political power. And what does the second word mean? A son or sons, because classical Chinese does not distinguish singular and plural. So literally, it only says the son or sons of a ruler. So why did you translate it as gentleman? Sorry? See? According to this young lady, 君子 should mean someone with ethical or moral accomplishments. And that is precisely what Confucius has done to this concept. And he likes to do this a lot, taking a well-established term or concept in his day and transform it into something more meaningful and significant. And in this particular instance, what we have here is as if Confucius was saying to those in power, 君子 shouldn't be understood as a title that can be inherited. A son of a ruler in those days, and in some countries even today, would inherit that position from his father, right? It's as if Confucius was saying, no, that is not how this should be understood. Those in a position to make political decisions should not be a title that can be inherited, but rather it is something that has to be earned. Yes, please. Yes. Very good. But the literal meanings are quite different. If you look at the literal meanings, you can just say you have two classes of people, those in power and those who are the commoners. Confucius is now saying, no, that is not how things ought to be. Rather, everyone ought to try to become a true 君子. And in that sense, then yes, gentleman would be quite an appropriate translation. So what's the next question? I should add, ancient China was essentially, yes, a patriarchal society. So in those days, he was probably thinking of men, but as a philosophical concept. And certainly in Confucian philosophy today, gender bias should no longer be a barrier. So the goal for Confucius is to recover the Tao, and to do that, everyone must now try to become what he calls a 君子 gentleman. What's the next question? How do you do it? And here it is described as cultivating the roots. When the roots are established, the way will grow. Evidently, the next question, what are these roots or fundamentals that we need to devote ourselves to cultivating? And here I would simply single out two concepts for your consideration. One is called 人, and the other is called 礼. Let's look at the concept of 礼 first. Again, how many of you would know this word in simplified Chinese? And this is the traditional version of it. What does it mean? What does it mean? Propriety. What else? I heard courtesy. What else? Manners. What else? Ritual. So which is the correct? In good MCQ fashion, all of the above. But you have to understand how concepts evolve, how meaning changes, how a certain concept can become richer, with philosophical interpretation, which is exactly what Confucius did. I want you to guess the original, really original meaning of this word li. This is what you find in the so-called oracle bones or oracular bones used for ancient divination in early China. What does this symbol suggest to you? It's fascinating, isn't it? How characters, symbols were formed in the ancient days. This signified a particular instrument or implement that was used in ancient Chinese religious rituals. So it's a particular object that you use in sacrifices made to the gods, made to heaven. And then came along Confucius. I mean, obviously he was under the influence of early Chinese religion, of course. But he was asking, what was the importance or significance of that particular object and religious ritual in general? Rituals, if you have the proper implements, would that be enough to appease the gods? If you have all the right tools placed, would that be enough? Would that be enough to satisfy the requirement of a religious ritual? What if these rituals, even with the right implements, were not performed in the proper way? Would that satisfy the requirement of religious ritual? Then Confucius was saying, hey, wait a minute. In the practice of religion, it is not just a question of having all the offerings, all the chicken, oranges, everything made ready for the gods, but the ritual itself has to be performed in the proper way. Is that all you can say about this concept? Think of expressions, for those of you again who know Chinese, think of expressions that involve this particular word, li. Let's say Sunday worship, going to churches. Li what? Li. Literally, what does that suggest? Literally, what does that suggest? Li Bai is Sunday. But literally, what does it mean? How? What is Bai? It is this, isn't it? So that the religious sense is still very clear. What is manners in Chinese, the word? And what is the relationship between religious worship and ritual and manners? Yes? You see, think of a religious ritual. You do need your offerings, right? Whether it is incense, whether it is food, whether it is wine, you do need that. But in order for it to be successful, you need the ritual to be performed properly. One step further, everything you do must be performed properly. Hence, from the way you prostrate yourself before the gods, to the way you greet your parents, to the way you deal with friends, everything takes on this dimension of Li. And that is one particularly important contribution of Confucius thinking. Now, why is it important? Can you think of any society that does not have this element of proper conduct? Think of general examples. Handshakes, bowing. How important is it? How important do you think that is? Think of a world absent of Li of any form. And what kind of society would that be? From the way you speak, from the way you interact, any behavior, any aspect of social living is regulated by Li, without which the argument here is that conflict will inevitably ensue. Is that all it does? Proper conduct as a regulative concept, regulating human behavior when we come into contact with other human beings. There's a stronger argument here in that Li is also seen to be constitutive in the sense that it will come to shape the kind of person that we become. How many of you been to Japan? How important is bowing? Why? After living in Japan for a bit, I began bowing even when I talk to someone on the telephone. Have you, see, this is not about regulating conduct anymore. This is about shaping the kind of person that I may become. And that, I think, is the importance of this concept. And in the Analects itself, you find an explicit statement from Confucius to the effect that Li, which we may loosely translate as proper conduct, is critical or essential to social harmony. And harmony here also has an active verbal sense of harmonizing various interests, harmonizing different groups, bringing them together through the magic, if you like, of Li. If you bow to someone, do you have to mean it? I seldom do. Good morning becomes good morning, doesn't mean anything, does it? Huh? Mama, 早上好, and then you rush out. In other words, if you think that Li is important, you have to, by force of reason, then come to question whether the act has to be performed with sincerity. And that is the second part of Confucius' approach to recovering the Tao. And this he describes as the concept of Ren. And this is what he says. If a person lacks Ren, and what has to do with proper conduct? When rituals degenerate into formalistic ritualism without any shred of meaning, then it will have lost is intended purpose. But you have to find a concept to describe this sense of sincerity and commitment, meaning what you do. And that is what he refers to as ren. Now, I shouldn't have put the translation here. I wanted to ask you how you would translate it first. This is what the character looks like today. Still, how many of you have a name that includes the word ren in it? Okay, no, not this audience, but it's fairly common. Huh? Okay, explain this word to me just by looking at it. I think even our youngest audience would know this part, the right-hand side part. What is the symbol on the right-hand side of this character? What does it mean? Whatever the concept means, it does not mean one. Whatever the concept means, it has something to do with interpersonal relations. It has to do with relating to other people. And this is the older version of the character. Maybe I shouldn't have included it here, but this is the version that is found in some of the recently excavated manuscripts found in China. But we won't go into that. We focus on this sense of ren as somehow involving how one deals with other people, how one interacts with other people. And how do we determine that? There's only one way, and that is go to the analects itself and see what the text has to say to us. Well, this one, he will be free of malevolence. I think that would suggest that ren has this sense of benevolence, doesn't it? How about here? Now this Junzi person never abandons ren. So this is something that is absolutely important. And men of ren would not do anything contrary to this ideal, just to protect their own lives. So important that they would rather sacrifice themselves in order to pursue and complete the project of ren. This character is used way over 100 times in the Analects. You see, I've been in NTU for too long. Sometimes I actually use statistical methods. It does tell you something. If a concept is used repeatedly in a text, it at least gives you an indication of its place in a particular tradition. So what does it mean? Read some more. First quotation, translate please. This is the name of a disciple asked about this concept of ren, and the master Confucius replied. What does it mean? That seems simple enough. Love your fellow human beings. I think one of you should be very happy. What you yourself do not desire, do not impose on or do to others is what is meant by ren. Often called the golden rule of Confucian philosophy. Although the early Jesuit missionaries who came to China described it as the silver rule. Why is that? Because the version in the Judeo-Christian Bible is phrased in a positive manner and not in a negative sense. But nevertheless, there are other passages in the Analects, in the Lenyu, that would give a positive meaning of ren. It's not just about yourself, also establishes others, helps others, brings out the best qualities in others, and does not simply look at his own interests or benefits. Someone mentioned the distinction between the 君子 and the morally deficient earlier, and this is certainly a very clear contrast. I want you to consider 人 and ask yourself whether it is a particular virtue in the sense that you would simply put 人 as one among many other moral virtues. Virtue is an interesting word. It is a count noun. You can put it in the plural. There are many different virtues. Virtue is also a mass noun, singular, like water. So, 人, would you consider it as a particular or specific virtue? In which case, it would then mean something like benevolence, love, and you can place it alongside righteousness, trustworthiness. What else? All the other virtues that you can think of. One among many. Or would you consider it as a general virtue that can subsume all the specific or particular virtues? Here is probably the most debated question in Confucian philosophy. If you translate 人 as humanity, you are saying it should be understood as a general virtue. It is what the ideal human being ought to be, and you can further describe that by enumerating all the moral virtues that you hold to be important, such as righteousness, such as justice, such as trustworthiness, wisdom, courage, and so on. 人 as an umbrella virtue encompassing all the others, or as a particular virtue, one among many others. In fact, if you read the Analects, you'll find both usages. I tend to consider a gradual transformation of the concept. Just as Confucius considered Li, first of all, as a very specific meaning, particular ritual, implement, object, thinking about why that is important, and then realizes that the importance does not lie in the object, but how you perform the ritual. And then one more step of philosophical extension, then you realize that, hey, it's not just in performing a religious ritual I ought to do properly, but rather in everything I do, I have to adopt the same sense of proper conduct. And one step furthermore, one further philosophical extension, then you begin to question, hey, wait a minute, this morning when I greeted my parents, I didn't really mean it. From the external, gradually to the internal, and this is where I would position the concept of 人. Now, here, in that sense, I would consider 人 as an incipient moral sensibility. Love as arising from a very primal sense of who you are, but it has to be expressed, once again, in proper conduct. And this is how important the concept is. And I think this is, I quoted it also because this is one of the most often cited passages from the 论语, that a 君子 cannot but be strong and resolute, for his burden is heavy, and his Tao is long. You see, the metaphor of the Tao figures again, and he takes Ren as his burden, and only with death does his journey come to an end. So, what do you think if I were to, I forgot to give you checkers, and you can vote whether you would consider Ren as a particular, specific, or general virtue. But I want to come now to another concept which was raised earlier by the audience. You see, in the Analects, you have read this. The Junzi gentleman cultivates the roots, and the roots, when they are established, the Tao will grow. But I didn't give you the full passage. The same speaker now goes on to say, now shouldn't filial piety and respect for elders be recognized precisely as the roots of Ren? How many of you would consider filial piety to be the most essential, important concept of Confucian philosophy? Certainly still very influential, very pervasive in Chinese culture. And beyond China, in Japanese, same character. In Korean, same, before they changed to alphabet. Same in Vietnamese. One could argue in Singapore too. What do you think? Is filial piety important in Singapore? How many of you would say yes? Then you would probably agree with a survey that was conducted not that long ago by the Family Circle of Singapore. I mean, just basically ranking values among Singaporeans, and concern for the family is certainly ranked very high in this country. Now, just to show you how influential the concept has become. Again, this is a translation test. Could someone please translate these 4 characters for me? Lying down on the ice. To get what? To get the fish. Yeah, one kind of fish. Why? Why would anyone want to do that? Isn't that wonderful? All these stories are beginning to come back. This one may be even more famous. Please, tell me, what is the story behind these 4 characters? No? Doesn't ring a bell? Just look at the characters. First word, what does it mean? Sell what? Sell yourself into servitude. I just put in the blanks, huh? In order to... Would you do that? How many of you have heard of this story? Finally. Oh, this one is really crazy. What does it say? Less well known, perhaps. If your parents are being bothered by mosquitoes, what would a filial child do? Come, bite me, bite me. And these stories have developed into wonderful traditions in both art and literature, exemplified by the so-called 24 paragons of filial piety. You can find versions in the history of Chinese art. You can find equally wonderful versions in Japanese art and Korean art. So just to give you a sense of the pervasive influence of this concept of filial piety in East Asian culture. In the 21st century, however, would anyone actually take off their shirt, lie on the ice, in order to catch a fish? I don't think it's legal to sell yourself into servitude anymore. if you were a government that wants to promote filial piety, what would you do? Ah, very good. Very good. And this is how one country does it. I'm sorry I didn't have time to translate all of them. Number 3, what does it say? Hosting birthday parties for parents. Number 4, cooking for them personally. Number 9, this is important. Number 11, why is that important? Why is that important? As if to suggest we don't do that often enough. Whoops. This one later. Number 16, very important. Not applicable to Confucius' time. And then something about doing physical exercises with them. No longer exemplary stories that would reflect filial conduct, but more practical advice from the Chinese government, and this was promulgated a few years ago. So it is quite recent. It's quite recent. That gives you a sense of how important this concept remains. And I want to show you a short clip, which I think is really quite fun. Even if you don't understand.
阿公啊，真久无看到你的囝个。
伊人啊，也无闲，也做工做。我的查某囝是老爷来哦。
老爷啊，我都甲你讲啊，一个查甫，一个查某好啊。
你后生安怎？伊啊，也无闲诶。伊即个生意啊，是做零子。伊等咱的政府啊，佫有生意来往。美国啊、香港啊，佫有伊本八老德啊。 個有啊，伊喺度諗沙拉買一間新厝。
咁樣沙拉袂歹啊。
好啊，
比我會更好。伊是 doctor 來嘅，大倫敦啊 ，specialist 啊，係咪啊 ？cardiology， 伊真夠賺累嘅。
安尼搞啊？
是咧，你會找安怎？
我逐擺拍電話伊吼，伊一下無閒嘅哦，伊若喺啲會計樓做工吼，我淡薄過分啦。真出名嘅會計樓，我都唔知影叫乜嘢名吼。到特別吼，伊一年內面會賺到差唔多450千哦。
是咯，我係驚，伊一鬥開刀啊，會賺20千英鎊啊，一日會開2個啊。邊啊？邊？
你會驚哩？
我驚好啊，我驚係嚟載我了咯。
載咯？
是咯，真麻煩咯，逐擺去倒落都愛帶我去行哦。
你再隨來哦。
乖囝來了，乖囝，你來，我早先啊。
媽好喎。
好啊。
媽，เดี๋ยวนี้ร้านคือกินม้าแล้วเนาะ
叫我輪真靈嘞。
So, any crying eyes in the house? It's quite lovely, isn't it? Huh? And it shows you the continuing influence of the concept. So what does it mean? If you look at the Analects, you realize it certainly has pre-Confucian roots, and once again being reinterpreted, find fresh meaning by Confucius in order to raise it to a philosophically significant concept that can actually become the roots of humanity. And this, I think, will give you a sense, at least a distinction, that filial care and affection, filial piety in Chinese is termed xiao, certainly it's more than taking care of one's elders, parents, physically, materially. And this is a very strong condemnation, really. If that is all you do, then you're treating your parents no better than your pets or livestock. But rather, filial piety is now interpreted beyond providing for one's parents physically and materially as a habit of the heart, something that would transform you as a person and which takes into account kinship as well as ethical responsibility. I wrote a paper once describing both the embeddedness and embodiment of this particular concept. I will just go through it very quickly. Now, one may argue that filial care and affection is a universal human trait. So what makes it distinctively Confucian? Every culture has it, don't they? In a sense that it's true, but it is also embedded in a network of virtues together with other virtues that would provide a distinctive meaning to the Confucian interpretation of xiao. And what I described in that particular work is to suggest that xiao reflects a deep ethical, moral sentiment, finding expression in the affection and care that parents extend to their children, and reciprocally, and that is the important point, in the latter's, in the children's response in the form of a sense of responsibility. And how do you explain the universality of a concept like filial affection and care, common to all cultures, and yet somehow distinctive in the Confucian context? No better way than to look at chicken soup. I would submit to you, I would argue that most, if not all cultures, have chicken soup. I will further submit to you that not all chicken soups are the same. Do you agree or disagree? How are they different? How are they the same? How do you cook chicken soup? Common, you do need the chicken. This is the common humanity core that is common according to this argument to all. And yet, this core ethical sentiment is always interacting with other ingredients that together would give it its distinctive flavor. Have you tried ginseng chicken soup? Does it taste more ginseng or chicken? That is the distinctive flavor. It blends into a unified taste. But if you isolate, hey, chicken, you also find in other chicken soups. And yet the way it is cooked, the ingredients, the measure, will give each culture its distinctive flavor. So you often hear, filial piety, this sense of ethics is common to all cultures. So what makes any particular tradition special or distinctive? Really, I think this is one good approach to differentiating both the universality, what is universal, as well as what is culturally specific. So not all chicken soups are the same. but I like them all. Because in different ways, they all cooked together what is essential to being human into a particularly fitting and appropriate expression in a cultural context. Which one do you like? Which one have you tried? So, virtues I don't think exist ever in isolation. Filial piety has to be complemented, informed by proper conduct. You may love your parents, but if you do not express that properly, the result would be counterproductive. So you see how Li and Xiao always go hand in hand. And certainly counterbalanced by other virtues such as righteousness, that together make the concept distinctive in the Confucian context. Now, of course, chicken soups do resemble one another, so you can argue that there may be family resemblances. And in the end, that could well offer a bridge to bring different cultures together. It is also embodied in a particular person, which is basically to say that you cannot take xiao or filial piety or any virtue for granted as if it is a given. In the Confucian tradition, xiao is very clearly explained to be a lifelong process. It requires constant attention and constant cultivation. Now, I think I won't go through all of it, except to conclude with general remarks about this notion of harmony. Everybody talks about Chinese philosophy as championing this grand idea of harmony, and it has become a very potent political rhetoric, especially in mainland China today. The Chinese dream, what is that about? It's about this grand society marked by harmony. But what actually does harmony mean? What does it mean? What does harmony mean to you? Yes, please. Yes. In what way? Coexistence. See, then I always come back to the same circular coexistence. In what way? In a harmonious way. But what does it mean to you? What kind of analogy would you make? The Chinese word is what for harmony? 和, especially, right? Usually one would think of music. Wouldn't you? Musical harmony. How does musical harmony work? How does musical harmony work? Different instruments, yes. Then what? What did they do? Performing in unison according to a predetermined musical score in order to realize the kind of musical harmony. Clear division of labor. The strings, you can still hear the strings, the percussion, but every instrument somehow working wonderfully together to create this wonderful harmony, harmonious music. 和 in Chinese philosophy actually has another meaning. How else would you use the word 和? Again, my favorite in cooking. Think, for those of you who know Chinese, I'm sorry, I apologize to those who do not, but think of the Chinese word 调. What does it mean? Blending think of the character If you pronounce it in a slightly different way, what does it mean? Dao, meaning what? Same character. Meaning what? A tune or melody. You see, in early Chinese philosophy, you already have two very different senses of harmony. One akin to music production. One, however, is more like cooking. How does cooking create harmony? Oh dear, it's so late already. I must apologize. But the point I'm trying to make before, well, actually, I can conclude now. I hope, because I did 53 videos, I'm trying to. So harmony, in one sense, one can say Confucian philosophy is trying to provide this musical score, trying to provide this blueprint for everyone to work together in order to create the kind of harmony that you want. Another interpretation of Confucian philosophy would be a bit more open and inclusive, as if to say it's okay to add new ingredients, but the process of harmonizing the different ingredients would still give you the kind of harmony that you want. And for my part, I would like to think that the future of Confucian philosophy lies in being open and inclusive, and yet maintaining the commitment to creating a world of harmony marked by humanity as well as propriety. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize again, I overran.
Do you have any questions to ask Prof. Chan? There's one over there. Can we pass the mic to him, please? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent talk. I'm very amazed how similar is Confucius to Socrates. I think because both of them are very interested in virtue and how do we teach people to be virtuous. But in what they differ a lot is that Socrates considered filial piety as a way to make people virtuous, but rejected the idea because he realized that the sons of brave people were not brave themselves, and the fact that being virtuous does not mean that you know what virtue is and you know how to teach virtue to other people. What do you think will be the defense of Confucius against this attack on his beliefs?
Family resemblance first, because both recognize the importance of cultivation of virtue. The difference is what is the optimal way to achieve that goal. On the Confucian side, the argument is that the family will provide the best nurturing environment in order to bring out these virtues in any individual, supported by wider circles of social relationships. On the side of ancient Greek philosophy, the idea is that the more effective way would be to have children coming together and being raised by the community altogether. So I don't see them as conflicting in the sense that they are mutually exclusive, but they are rather different means to achieving the same desired outcome. That's how I would compare the two traditions. In the end, they still want the best chicken soup, I think.
Thank you very much. I think you said a lot of good things about Confucius, and then apparently, yes, very useful for the society. You also mentioned about, like in China, right now they emphasize social harmony. This might be a bit unrelated to what you spoke, but I'm just curious. In the 60s, right? So in China, as you recall, they have this anti-Confucius movement.
Yes.
What is the underlying reason for that, and why that was such a threat? Obviously to the government at that time. Yeah.
That is an excellent question. which I discussed in video 3.14. You see, that's why I wanted to bring out this tension between orthodoxy on the one hand and renewal and innovation on the other. It happens to every tradition. When the Buddha died, what did his disciples do? They quarreled. When Jesus Christ died, when the young church was being formed, also schisms, major disagreements. No different in the case of the Confucian tradition. Some of the early literature tell us that soon after Confucius' death, there were no fewer than 8 schools of Confucianism, each trying to claim that their interpretation is the right interpretation. And then they will bring their version to those in power to adopt it as state ideology, which eventually happened during the Han Dynasty. And from that point on, when Confucianism became a part of the state, it really changed many, many things. Confucianism became more and more aligned with state interests, and that entailed a lot more regulation, a lot more rigid standardization. Think fast forward another 1,000 years, no more innovation, no more renewal, to such an extent that you find China in crisis. The Opium War, one after another, series of major defeats. Then in the early 20th century, the young intellectuals at that time, just like Confucius, were concerned with the disorder that was totally rampant. China was sinking fast. And put yourself in that position. How would you analyze, diagnose the problem? If I were back then, I would first of all say the problem was due in large part to that kind of rigid Confucian teachings, which may not be the same as what Confucius originally taught, but how a tradition became more and more stagnant, only for the purpose of control. So in that context, you find major critiques of Confucianism. The early 20th century, the so-called May 4th movement, one very popular slogan was, "Down with Confucius and Sons." Later, when Mao came to power, he wrote a famous essay in which he said, "For the new China to rise, the old China must die." And then later on, he also wrote another essay saying that for the new China, you must also summarize, recapture what is best in the tradition from Confucius to Sun Yat-sen. But nevertheless, you could see how Confucianism was associated with all the bad things that happened in traditional pre-modern China that led to almost 200 years of foreign domination. In that context, the same rhetoric resurfaced in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution. And today you see tremendous revival of Confucianism in China. Maybe for political reasons, but also I think there's also a groundswell of recognition that culture is not like clothing that you can discard. Culture is really what makes who you are. It doesn't matter whether you live in China or outside. Being brought up in a certain tradition means it has left an indelible mark on your person.
Ladies and gentlemen, Prof. Chan, do you want to entertain one more question? Sure.
But I really apologize.
I want to know how does one access the course on the computer.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to advertise.
Is it open to all?
Yes,
Okay, very good.
NTU online courses
Uh-huh.
work with a internet service provider, a platform called Coursera, which came out of Stanford University.
Yeah.
So already there are some NTU courses there,
Yeah.
and mine, I hope, would be next.
It's
So
not
you
on-
just go to the
Is
Coursera.
it on now?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. Okay.
Still in post-production.
How does one know it's on?
You go to the Coursera website, you register, and then they will keep sending you, what is new, recommendations and all that. But next February, next March, I will try my best.
Look out for NTU. You can find all the courses there. I think, Prof. Chan, one last question. I think he has been waiting. Just one last question. if you don't mind.
Sure.
There's this one scholarly debate quite often, which I think there's this debate about whether Singapore is a Confucius society. So there's some say yes, some say no. Then what are your views about this?
That is a very difficult question. It's like, again, I go down Orchard Road and ask. You're Confucian?
No, Lee Kuan Yew say
No, I wouldn't say that. That would imply that Singapore as a society recognizes Confucianism as an official ideology. I would approach it as Confucianism as a diffused tradition, spreading, seeping into the culture in all aspects, whether it is education, whether it is in terms of family values, whether it is in terms of emphasis on education. You can always find elements of the Confucian tradition in those aspects of culture that are important to Singapore society. And that's why I raised the question whether we can be considered anonymous Confucians, in the sense that I might actually think that Confucius is a very outdated, old-fashioned person who doesn't understand innovation. I could argue, and yet at the same time being influenced by certain aspects of the tradition that traces itself to Confucius.
Well, in your interest time, we have to stop the lecture now. Let's put our hands together to thank Professor Chan for such a wonderful presentation and sharing.